This lecture will look at the further refinement of the neoclassical style, with the artists that became synonymous with the movement, that being Jacques Louis David in France, Antonio Canova in Italy, and once again Flaxman in England. Together, they will take the lessons learned from the previous artists already discussed and look at and further refine the style based on contours and classical sensibilities. Perhaps the most famous neoclassical artist, Jacques Louis David, would be a student of Vien that we discussed last time, as well as even a relative of Boucher, the Rococo painter. He would study in Rome, winning the Prix de Rome, that being the prize which allowed him, through state sponsorship, to study in Rome proper the ancient statues that we were discussing. And of course, he would favor academic teachings and a didactic approach to art. That being, he believed art should teach a moral lesson and not merely be self-gratifying like Rococo art. He would uphold the Enlightenment belief that subject matter will always be paramount, teaching a particular civic virtue in his paintings. He was the first to successfully combine this new noble subject matter with these classicizing elements and forms, or in the ancient style. He was in Rome with Vien, his mentor, in 1775, where he would distill statues that he was looking at to simple flowing outlines. Here we can see in his studies of classical statues in the Vatican from 1780 that he would first sketch in pencil these statues and then go back over them with pen, reinforcing the outline with a simple wash. Therefore, we do not have live gradations of these different tonal modulations. It's breaking it down to its essential qualities to be very striking. One can see the results of his studies in the Andromache Mourning Hector of 1780, which was intended as the morceau de réception, or the reception piece that would gain him entry into the French Academy, showing his mastery of the medium, which he produced shortly after returning from Rome. In the painting, we have an illustration of an episode in Homer's Iliad, where Hector has been killed by the Greek hero Achilles and is mourned by his wife Andromache and his son Astyanax. Now, in the article you'll also be reading, we find that Campen will state that this is a good example of alterity or otherness, whereby the woman is set up in opposition to the man in how she behaves. In fact, we're reinforcing the role here of women as ones of mothers, daughters, and wives. Notice, of course, that she is forlorn and is mourning the death very emotionally of her husband, while, of course, his body lays stoically there, very powerfully showing his moral superiority. The episode follows the great battle and clash between Hector, the greatest warrior of the Trojans, and Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks. Hector had just killed Achilles' friend, and so in revenge, Achilles sets out to in turn take Hector's life, refusing him proper burial rites and rituals until his son, his father, King Priam, comes and begs for the body back from Achilles. Now we find that the body is ready for interment and proper ritual. Now, the style used here by David is going to reinforce the contours of the figures and their sculptural qualities, thus, of course, laying out the body of Hector for one to see with this flat backdrop, which does not allow us to continue off into the background, instead forcing our attention on the highlighted figures in an almost tenebristic fashion, as we find the mournful look of Andromache as she gestures very clearly with this affetto, or this affectation, showing us where to look, as both her and her son mourn the death of this good man. This reminds us of Joseph Wright of Derby and the Corinthian Maid, whereby reinforcing contours is one of the most recognizable aspects of the neoclassical style, clearly showing us where the figures begin and end. And the dark background reinforces this as they're set against it, both in terms of tonality and in terms of the contours. Here we have a great tragedy appropriate for the Greeks, whereby Hector is described as a family man, a good man, who was a good son to his father King Priam, a good husband to his wife Andromache, a good father to his son Astyanax, and the greatest soldier the Trojans had. Therefore, we emphasize through his powerful body this character of Hector. And this is going to be compared to the tête expression of Andromache, or where we see the expression of the heads quite literally, as shown by Charles Lebrun, as we discussed earlier in the Baroque class, whereby we clearly see that she's showing this affectation of sadness, of loss on her face. Now, of course, the tragedy is going to further as Astyanax will be thrown off the walls of Troy. For, as the Greeks would say, only a fool kills the father and leaves the son for revenge. And so we have a double tragedy here as Troy falls. Now, turning to perhaps one of the most famous works of the neoclassical age, we have the Oath of the Horatii here. The first royal commission, importantly, this is paid for by the king, which was executed during David's second stay in Rome between 1784 and 85. We see that in a painting commissioned for the crown in order to recruit troops into the French military, and that is going to be one set in ancient Rome, the Oath of the Horatii. So in the Oath of the Horatii in 1784, preceding the French Revolution, though it becomes a symbol of the French Revolution, ironically enough, you have a very popular scene that people would be familiar with at the time, because of a play performed repeatedly in public by Pierre Corneille. So you find that Corneille's play is going to be based on Livy, the Roman historian's account of an episode in pre-Republican Rome where Rome is at war with Alba. And you find that these two nations decide to agree on the winner in a conflict by choosing their three breast warriors on each side, so that the Romans choose the three Horatii brothers, seen here to the left, taking an oath with the swords held by their father to fight to the death for Rome, and they will fight the Horatii brothers, right, for the Albans. As with his painting of Andromache, this is also a tragedy, one setting up self-sacrifice for the state, for only one of the Horatii examples here is going to be married to Sabina, a sister of the Curatii. One of the Curatii, in turn, is engaged to Camilla, the sister of the Horatii. So, no matter what happens in the outcome of the battle, one of the families will be losing a son, a husband, a father. Now, only one Horatius survives, and he once again is going to curse, or will be cursed by his sister Camilla for killing her fiancé in battle. Horatius thus kills her for her rebuke, stating that she should be on the side of the state and not her family. And this sets up that conundrum of whose loyalty lies where. And for women, they state that their loyalty lies to their family first, whereas for men, it's to the state first. So David, once again, is going to paint this scene, but then requested another scene actually instead to emphasize this sacrifice. The scene he wanted to paint was the one after the battle, whereby Horatius is going to kill his sister for rebuking him, stating, "Go to your lover, since you have forgotten your brothers, dead and living, and your country too. May every Roman woman die who laments an enemy," he states. In this earlier commission, we find that Horatius is tried for murder but is acquitted. His father defends him, as with this tragedy in that the charge is morally dubious, that being that he had the right to kill his own flesh and blood because he put the state first. So this is not actually a part of recorded history or part of the story. Instead, what we see here with the Oath of the Horatii is not the trial, is not the rebuke, and is not the murder of the sister. Instead, it relies on contemporary patriotic oaths that people would be familiar with, stating their patriotism and their loyalty to the state. So what we have here is an episode that requires minimum action, but emphasizes maximum drama. So here we have the moment that they state that they will fight to the death for their country. Now, if you look to the left in this stark interior space, representing the serious, grave nature of this oath these men are taking, you find that masculinity in this Enlightenment era is illustrated by positive virtues, such as courage and patriotism, loyalty to, once again, the government and to the common good, to fight to the death. So they are active, open poses, they are virile and ruddied figures, muscular and ready to fight. At the right, we find the feminine emotions are ones that are, and characteristics are negative. They are pejorative. They are going to emphasize the love that these women feel and the sorrow and despair, because one of the Horatii sisters seen here is married to one of the Curatii, the men that they are about to fight, and vice versa. Therefore, someone is going to lose a husband, a brother, a father, as you see the children here in the background, are going to be looking on at their father and brothers here making this oath and are about to die. One should notice also how expected behavior unfolds as the women are overcome with emotion and despair and collapse into closed forms, again noted in the foreground right. Camilla rests her head on her sister-in-law, Sabina, as they of course understand the sacrifice that is to come for their family. In the background, a nurse is going to cover up the children, trying to avert their eyes to what is happening with their fathers. But we find here that the eldest boy still looks on, showcasing what should be done with masculine virtue, that he is emulating the men who, eyes open, are going into this willingly. Campen would note in the notion of alterity that women here are devalued as the other. They are not sacrificing in the same way or accepting the sacrifice, we might say, for the country, as they mourn their fiancé who is an enemy of the state. Kaufmann as well would set up the woman as self, thus rejecting anything that is trivial. So here we have two different interpretations of what a woman could and should be doing. Each, of course, are disparaging the overtly materialistic and emotional aspects of womanhood. Here we find that masculine courage and patriotism are going to be combined with loyalty. Thus, we have all the positive attributes with the Enlightenment of overcoming one's emotions stoically. Winckelmann would of course note that this is appropriate when it comes to classical statuary and this idea of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, the two ideas that most permeated his treatment on elevating ancient statuary above that of what is modern. This reinforces the stoicism that one should sacrifice emotionalism to logical moral virtues. So you find that this is going to be a royal patron, but will become a symbol for the revolution to sacrifice oneself for one's country, and just transitions from sacrificing oneself for king to the republican ideals of democracy. But if you compare it to Poussin, you can see that we have figures that are lined up against a backdrop that is only there to show us where we are and to set a location, not to distract us and draw us into this area because it is shadowy, it is sparse, it is spared down, it is Spartan, if you will, whereby we have archaeologically observed attitudes and costumes in these individuals who are going to be dressed in the military attire of the day, that are going to be swearing, right, with their right arms, or at least the figure closest to us, taking your fides levata, your faithful raising of the right hand to fight to the death. And that they do, being all of them but one are going to die, coming back victorious. Thus Rome will be victorious thanks to the sacrifice of these two brothers. Now, the scene, interestingly enough, is not emotional. The appeal here is to logic, is to override the emotional considerations that one will lose one's life and or lead to the suffering of one's family. Another painting that is often seen as a precursor to the Revolution was exhibited at the Salon of 1787, that being the death of Socrates. Here, even though we seem to have revolutionary themes, it is also from and for an aristocratic patron, just like the Oath of the Horatii. In it, we find, recorded in Plato's Phaedo, that the Socrates, convicted of corrupting the Athenian youth, is shown here in a bare prison awaiting his execution. In fact, Socrates takes willingly the hemlock from the man handing it to him in the center, who looks away, once again in sadness, as he still keeps teaching his final lesson of Stoicism. Here we find again the contrast between those acting emotionally and stoically. Socrates' philosophy, remember, was that the soul is immortal, thus Stoicism, whereas the mortal flesh is going to contain and exhibit the emotions. One should, of course, focus on the eternal spirit and be stoical rather than mourn the death of your mortal flesh. In the same way, we find that Andromache is going to be mourning her husband Hector. Here we find that, in fact, it's not taken directly from Plato's Phaedo, but instead Diderot's treatise on dramatic poetry of 1758 would here have a scene that would be perfect for this pantomime, as Diderot sets out, stating that a painter should use the death of Socrates as an example to show how these gestures can showcase the variety of emotions with the death of this great thinker. Whereas the examples in painting just cited by Jacques Louis David cannot be mistaken for classical statuary because the painting looks nothing like that which was unearthed in Herculaneum or Pompeii. Sculptors had a different challenge. Sculptors wanted to make a style that was differentiated from that which was antique, yet still modern. So they wanted to emulate the style of classical antiquity without being accused of either plagiarism or having it be mistaken for something that was classical. So we find that it is ironic that classicism, or rather neoclassicism, comes along later in sculpture than in painting. Very interestingly, the opposite as in the Renaissance, because they started copying sculpture first and then started introducing these classical ideals into painting. So what we find here is that they're set back not only by the stylistic concerns, but by conservatism. That being, the cost of materials is much higher in sculpture than it is in painting. And so we find that it is going to be more cost prohibitive to make these leaps and to have these new styles tried out first. Again, the problem with neoclassicism in sculpture is that the ideal beauty of antiquity is trying to be revitalized and reinvigorated here, but you don't want to mistake it for something that is actually ancient, like Praxiteles or these other ancient sculptors. Therefore, you need likeness plus a new type of idealism that are brought together simultaneously. Therefore, we're not attempting with these new round of and these new neoclassical sculptures, not attempting to copy classical sculpture, but trying to capture its essence, to capture its spirit, so that it looks classical in its essence, but not directly in its style. Enter Antonio Canova. Here we have a sculptor with international fame who is known by way of newspapers and journals all over Europe. And he is the only Italian to excel late into the 18th century. There are no other famous Italians at this time. Now, he's born in Venice and would die in Rome, but would work for a variety of patrons, including Napoleon Bonaparte. Here, with his Theseus and the Minotaur, one that is life-size, we have an image of quiet contemplation rather than overt violent action. The scene is going to be one relating to the myth of the Minotaur on Crete. And the answer is the story relating to Theseus and the Minotaur. Now everyone knows the Minotaur, that being the head of a bull on the body of a man, a grotesque beast that was fed virgins to devour alive in human sacrifice periodically from the Greek mainland. Now, how we get to the Minotaur is an interesting story because King Minos makes an agreement with Poseidon to sacrifice his best bull every year. Only one year a bull was born that was so perfect, so beautiful, that he could not bear to part with it. So he sacrifices a lesser bull instead. We find that Poseidon, of course, then states, if you love your bull so much, I'm going to make your queen fall in love with the bull. So Pasiphae falls madly in love with this bull, that's King Minos' queen. She comes to Daedalus, the greatest craftsman and inventor of the ancient world, and asks him to construct her a hollow cow costume to climb into, so that the bull could then have congress with her and impregnate her. 9 months later, the Minotaur is born. The bull of Minos, literally, is what it translates. So here is a later painting from Pompeii of the bull costume or the cow costume that Pasiphae is climbing into in order to make love to the bull. This is the punishment of King Minos for trying to trick or betray a god. So we find that King Minos demanded 14 youths from Athens to feed the Minotaur on lunar cycles. We find that Theseus is going to be the prince of Athens, who is going to succeed in slaying the Minotaur with Ariadne's help, Ariadne being the daughter of Queen Pasiphae and King Minos. She betrays her parents and helps Theseus to slay the Minotaur by giving him a clue, which is a ball of yarn that he uses to find his way back out of the labyrinth, the house of the double axes for sacrificial slaughter. He then, of course, takes her back to Athens, but drops her off on the island of Naxos and leaves her to die en route. Because she betrayed her father, she would not make a good wife in the Greek tradition and belief system. One can see in the illustration of this particular episode that it is quite different from its Baroque predecessors, in that the figure is largely viewable from one angle and is closed in its form, as is common for most of Canova's art. In fact, the hero Theseus looks down, contemplative of the victory he has just won, along with this divine intervention holding the club over the Minotaur, who lies lifeless and crumbled below him. Very different from, say, Bernini and his figures that are intertwined, walking out towards us, engaging the spectator. Instead, we find a similar interest in contour as that of David, whereby the hero can be traced very clearly, leaning on the dead body of the Minotaur, looking down, all of his limbs closing in on the event afterwards, in quiet contemplation instead of dramatic action. Here we are going to see this as the first true resurrection of ancient sculpture. It is also easily mistaken for the antique, which shows the difficulty Canova had in trying to create a modern work after a classical prototype or precedent. Therefore, he starts to develop new takes on classical statuary to further differentiate this new neoclassical sculpture from ancient sculpture. One of the most famous examples where he succeeds in this is the Perseus, an over life-size statue of the hero who would decapitate the snake-haired Gorgon Medusa. wash ashore on an island and are going to be discovered by Dictys. His brother Polydectes is king of the island and desires Danae for his mistress. Perseus defends his mother's refusal to be the king's mistress, and so Polydectes pretends to marry Hippodamia, demanding a wedding gift from every young man on the island, a wedding gift of a horse no less. Now, knowing Perseus was poor because he does not have a father, thus did not inherit anything, we know that horses can only be afforded and owned by the aristocracy in archaic Greece and earlier. Perseus, of course, then boasts that he would bring anything else because he did not have money to purchase this horse, even the head of a Gorgon. So in heroic myth, we know that he has now found his adversary and the monster he will overcome. The Gorgon Medusa is going to be a tragic tale of a young woman who is raped by the sea god Poseidon in Athena's temple. Now, one cannot defile a temple with sex, and so Athena curses Medusa, causing her to turn into this horrific beast with snakes in her hair to turn anyone to stone that looks upon her. Now, Gorgons are going to be a type of monster in ancient Greece. We find that Medusa is going to be one of three sisters. She is the only mortal one. They are shown in pottery and art as a woman's body with wings. They have snakes for hair and boar's tusks. They must be approached right on foot, but they live at the edge of the world, so you cannot sneak up on them because they always have their back and can see everything around them. We know that Medusa was mortal, thus she can be killed, but her sisters can fly about given they have wings to protect her. To prepare for this battle, Athena helps Perseus. Athena, who of course is going to create this Gorgon Medusa to begin with, assists this male hero in conquering her. Athena tells Perseus to find the Gorgon's sisters, the Graeae, or the gray-haired women, to find the Stygian nymphs. These are often mistaken for the Fates, for they're going to be three old hags that share a single eye and tooth. They live near Atlas, supporting the world. Now, we know that once he finds them, Perseus grabs their eye and refuses to give it back until they reveal the location of these nymphs, which they do. Finding the nymphs, now Perseus receives the invisibility cap or helmet of Hades because he's known as the Invisible One. We cannot see the dead, they are invisible. He also receives winged sandals that allow him to fly and a leather pouch to conceal Medusa's head so it will not turn someone inappropriately to stone. They then also reveal the location of where Medusa is. Hermes then flies in and gives Perseus his sword and shield. Approaching Medusa, he uses the shield as a mirror, so he does not have to look at the Gorgon, which would turn him to stone, and removes her of her head. Here we have Athena helping Perseus with this curved blade remove the head of Medusa as blood spills out, but that's not the only thing that spills out. Out of the severed stump of Medusa's neck is going to be born the warrior Chrysaor, and from the blood, Pegasus, because, of course, she was impregnated by Poseidon when she was raped, and so these are the creatures that are produced because of it. Pegasus now is going to be ridden by Bellerophon, the Greek hero who bests and kills the Chimera. Finally, the sisters awake, hearing the screeches of their sister Medusa, but they cannot see Perseus because he is invisible, so he gets away. He then returns to his home island, finding his mother Danae and Dictys, his adoptive father, cowering at an altar for protection from Polydectes. He then walks into the palace and turns this king to stone, and establishes Dictys as the king of the island. The final ironic twist is that Perseus then gives Medusa's head to Athena, who then wears it on her shield or breastplate. Hence the blasphemy of having coitus in her temple is righted. It now is going to be shown on her. It is part of her. She has the power that she cursed this woman with. Here we find the episode of Perseus having beheaded Medusa, just as Theseus had already defeated the Minotaur. is an example of Canova's mature work that marries both of these interests in classical statuary and this new modern interest in neoclassicism. And it matches Winckelmann's descriptions of how one should feel when looking at ancient statuary, as we have here an ideal form combined with a sensual interpretation. As in classical statuary, it is laid out in profile to the viewer. Therefore, looking at it from an angle such as this photograph is not as clearly comprehensible as from the side, which is quite the opposite of the earlier versions such as Cellini's Perseus in Florence, which is going to be viewable from multiple angles and is only comprehensible when you walk around it. For the neoclassical sensibility, everything needs to be very graphic and comprehensible from one angle immediately, not unfolding over time. Therefore, the didactic aspects of the image are paramount. Here we can see how Canova's work emulates the Apollo Belvedere, both in position and form, but cannot be mistaken for it. The sensuous nature of the flesh is kept, but the position of the leg in contrapposto, as well as the head and the accoutrement that he carries, differentiates it from its ancient prototype. Therefore, we're taking the sun god Apollo and recasting him in the new role of Perseus. Therefore, we are emulating both the ideal of classic statuary and making reference to it at the same time. Here we find that he has turned from his approach of twisting forms with Theseus to one that is perpendicular in position to the profile, meaning that it is exactly parallel to the viewer and perpendicular to the ground plane. Therefore, swaying off to one side suggests motion, but it is a halted, balanced motion, with the head of Medusa in his left hand and the sickled sword for decapitating individuals in his right. Showcasing the neoclassical approach to wall tombs in the Augustina Kirche in Vienna, we have Canova producing a monument to the Archduchess Maria Christina, who was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor and the sister of Marie Antoinette. In the example here, we have an absence of Christian symbols that does not attempt to glorify the deceased nor redeem them. She is only shown in a medallion portrait being carried aloft by this allegorical figure. We find instead the rest of the figures are going to, in a procession, make their way into the dark interior space of this pyramid or wall tomb. Down below, we have an old figure who's going to be leaning on a cane along with a young child, representing the allegories of youth and old age, as they are led to the interior space of this tomb, sorrowfully, mournfully. Off to the side, we have the lion, which represents the monarchy and the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor, find behind them with a coat of arms, identified with the double eagle Hohenstaufen, with a psychopompos leaning on him, or this allegorical figure meant to carry souls from the land of the living to the land of the dead. Here we are marrying, as with the other examples, the real and the ideal, that being the procession that one would find at a funeral with the idealism. They are flawless, they are perfect in the same way that you would find in classical statuary. Here we find the same type of procession earlier on that Benjamin West was going to be known for with Agrippina as a particular example. Now, his sister, seen here, Pauline Borghese, marrying into the very old aristocratic Borghese family in Rome, is going to use the official sculptor to Napoleon, Antonio Canova, to show herself as the goddess Venus. Now, Napoleon and her husband are going to want to have her shown as Diana, the virgin goddess of the hunt. But instead, Pauline Borghese prefers the rather scandalous goddess of love and sex, identified here because she is nude, wearing a bracelet like the Venus of Urbino on her right arm, and holding an apple in her left hand, showing that she received that as the fairest from, once again, Paris in the Judgment of Paris. Now, we know that this painting was so scandalous that her husband would only show it to visitors by torchlight at night and kept it hidden right outside of the home, outside of the Villa Borghese, right, because he was so embarrassed that his wife is shown nude here and very publicly cheated on him and was a philanderer in public. What could he possibly do given that her brother was the emperor of France and controlled these areas, including Italy? Now, the archaeological accuracy appreciated by Canova and the Borghese here is going to show that Pauline is reclining on an accurate reproduction of a Greek bedstead with a table that would be used at symposia to eat and dine, right? So we know it's modeled on actual examples found, dug up, and reproduced from Herculaneum and Pompeii. The form of Venus here is going to be seen entirely made comprehensible from one angle. We find that her right arm is going to support her body, the torso, her bosoms, her abdomen, and then her lower section of her body, all facing towards the viewer as her face is in profile, looking off to her left, with the left arm closed in this fashion all the way around, not very dramatically and openly and theatrically engaging with something outside, but instead in a calm, static, and calculated fashion from antiquity, being the object of our gaze, passively seducing us, showing us her confidence in her body. Now, this is the opposite to the Baroque, and that's how you can understand the neoclassical era. It does not adopt the same type of dramatic exuberance seen in the Rococo and in the Baroque. Instead, it is calm, closed, calculating, and logical, instead of open and emotional and intuitive. This is a timeless beauty practiced by Canova and neoclassical artists that will show the streamline nature of bodies and the contours like seen with Ingres' Grand Odalisque that is going to be cold and erotic, mortal and divine simultaneously, and desirable certainly, yet distant from us. She is not inviting in the same way as more Baroque renditions. We see that again in Ingres' Grand Odalisque, as we can draw a line all the way around the body, yet it must be incredibly contorted and distorted in order to get in this position. It is very difficult, not natural, and certainly not inviting in a naturalistic fashion. Now, the ceramics factory that manufactures decorations for this new middle-class audience is going to be owned by Josiah Wedgwood, who is an entrepreneur who is going to manufacture thousands of these various vases and then designs to decorate these interior spaces. We know that John Flaxman is going to be the artist that he hires, who studied at the Royal Academy in London. He does not travel to Rome, but does have access to collections from ancient works in London. So we know that in 1787, he finally does make a trip to Rome, and that he is commissioned to illustrate a version of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, particularly for the linear motif. Here we have his Judgment of Paris from the illustration commissioned from Flaxman for the Iliad, showing that he models his work on classical vase painting. And this is then going to be sold in printed volumes of engravings of this intaglio process, whereby we see here Mercury delivering the apple of the Hesperides to the Trojan prince Paris, who then gives it to the fairest, that being Aphrodite, over again Minerva and Juno off to the side here. So these three goddesses represent the judgment of Paris, and in turn Aphrodite or Venus will give Paris, this Trojan prince, Helen of Sparta, thus sparking the Trojan War. But the entire work is carried out sans tonal variations and shading. It is entirely based on linear motifs and designs like vase paintings. This was seen as the counterpart to the beginnings of literature, where Homer is seen as the beginning of literature, or the primitiveness, that being careful contoured lines are all that are needed. Now this led once again to the instant fame of Flaxman, who returned to England in 1794, receiving public commissions. It is this interest that Josiah Wedgwood is going to adopt in his ceramics factory, reproducing and copying actual works from antiquity. The apotheosis of Homer, shown here in jasperware, one of his most popular types of pottery, which is fine-grained and unglazed, and a very colorful variety of pottery, almost in a robin's egg blue color here with white figures. The design is going to be taken from the ancient collection of William Hamilton. He's an antiquarian and has antiquarian interests. Thus, he has a great and expansive collection of Greek red figure vase paintings. Here we can see how Josiah Wedgwood has his artists and his ceramicists adopt the exact models from, again, this apotheosis of Homer, with the poet seated in the center, with, of course, the glories that he'll be crowned with surrounding him, and victory, showing that he will forever be remembered as the greatest poet who penned the likes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is going to be a simplified design that is mass-produced for the middle consumer class that is just expanded in England. And this is going to popularize the notion of Greek art as very rational and linear. Elsewhere, we have additional introductions of neoclassicism into public works of art at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the central and most important church. Here, Flaxman is also going to be responsible for sculptural works like the monument to Admiral Lord Nelson, finished in 1818. Here we can see it as a counterpart to that discussed in France with Jean-Antoine Houdon and his Admiral de Trouville, whereby we're going to be celebrating heroes of the British Army and Navy. Now this honors these naval heroes killed by the French, as we see the female figure of Britannia, the personification of Britain, pointing to the admiral with these two boys, showing that they should be emulating him and respecting him for his great sacrifice, whereas river gods are below, showing the expanse of the British Empire and how far their power stretches, from the Nile, the Copenhagen, and others. Down below we have the British lion, symbol of the monarchy, looking on, very fearlessly, growling at the spectator. Here, Britannia is actually based on statues of Minerva, but it is odd that the boys are going to be carrying school bags dressed in contemporary attire. The oversized lion with the excessive detail is also odd for neoclassical sculpture. Therefore, this is an example that is not well married, unlike that of Canova by way of classical statuary. We have different types of styles and illusions brought together, from the contemporary to the classical to even other anatomical inconsistencies. So if we compare it to that of Canova with the funerary monument, we can see that he is marrying, that being Canova is, the real with the ideal, showing something that is anatomically correct and believable, but elevating it above the everyday, filtering it through the classical lens. And that's not what Flaxman is doing. Turning to other works by Flaxman, here we have a grave stele for two sisters in affliction from 1804. In this one, we have dedicated to a middle-class patron a very simple tombstone or stele, where two sisters are going to be grieving, leaning into each other. Here we have the model taken from ancient Greek stele, whereby different family members would mourn the loss of a sister, a wife, a husband, showing overt emotion. So here we have a unified and very simple scene that is symmetrical. The faces are anonymous and unseen. Now, this is going to all come out of the Industrial Revolution. That being the Enlightenment is going to connect science to progress. This idea that if we put our faith in science, our lives will get better. We will progress. We'll be able to produce things more cheaply and abundantly. Things are going to be more available for a broader swath of the population. And throughout all of history, we see the replacing of the landed gentry or the land-based aristocracy with middle-class capitalists. As we mechanize manufacturing by the middle of the 18th century in England, it is fully felt throughout Europe and America by the middle of the 19th century. Now, this is going to lead to mass migrations of the urban poor to these urban areas. So people come from these rural areas who once worked for aristocrats, producing food and raising animals. But now they all are going to be given jobs in factories, though we have dreadful conditions that lead to and sow the seeds of revolution in 1848. This is going to see a radical shift in how the world is going to be organized and will forever impact how we all live, work, and then buy materials as consumers. This new approach to mass production of goods meant that these simple lines developed in Neoclassicism for England would lend themselves quite well to mass production. They are easy to replicate. Therefore, Neoclassicism as a high art form was seen as quite fashionable and was thus adopted during this era of mass production. For Flaxman, we find that he's going to create many designs for Wedgwood, who would hire many trained artists. And Flaxman, as mentioned, would copy from vases in the collection of William Hamilton. As in the example here, the Farnese Hercules is going to be one that was quite popular at the time, and owning a version of a famous classical statue became something that was sought after in even middle-class families. Here, taken from illustrations and engravings, the images of famous classical statues could easily then be modeled from and copied, emphasizing their contours for these new mass-produced objects, such as the medallion seen here. Therefore, consumer art would adopt this classical strategy. In the late 1700s, manufacturers would also adopt neoclassical designs. Britain became the leader here as the first nation to industrialize and also to have a consumer class that moved beyond the aristocracy as the primary patrons of the arts. The interest can be seen in the example here of the Etruscan dressing room, whereby the wallpaper, the designs, and the furniture are in stark contrast to the vegetal motifs and the growing ideas here associated with Rococo art, which of course was uncontrollable and irrational. Now we have the spindly forms from classical antiquity, kept within very strict geometric lines, contours, and shapes. The essence that we have here of this type of interior decoration was order and geometric order at that, with low stucco relief being predominant instead of the high relief of Rococo. The mirrors were not used, for instance, to open up the space, but instead they emphasized the flatness of the walls, quite the opposite of this Rococo approach to interior design. This comes from Pompeii and Herculaneum in the style that would emphasize these spindly geometric forms framing small motifs. Therefore, the Rococo was understood as this type of decadent culture, whereas Neoclassicism would be the return to order, simplicity, and harmony, very different in its intended outcomes. The style would be preferred by the American Republic and revolutionary France, as we will discuss moving forward, as the ideals were ones that were more readily adopted for a middle-class audience and one that was outside of the aristocracy. Next time, we'll continue on with Romanticism in England and look at the backlash against this type of logical and pagan interest.